Well, welcome everyone. We have a more than sold out room, so and that I guess is not surprising given who we have to speak to us today. So I just want to say welcome and thank you to all of you for joining us for this special event. We're truly honored to have Dr. Venkat Sumantran with us. He just released a book which has the excellent title, although he was just whispering it's a Obama-style book for a Trump administration era. Faster, Smarter, Greener. He has had an incredibly distinguished career. He's a former CEO of Tata Motors. He teaches at MIT, which is a place I used to teach, so we all know Chicago's better than MIT, but MIT is not such a bad place. And IIT Madras, he's the chairman of Solaris Technology, and has had a really long and distinguished career in autos, industrial equipment, defense, and aerospace. So his book really has a kind of fascinating starting, at least my read of it, is that the starting premise of it is, suppose that cities are no longer designed for autos, and suppose instead that cities are designed for people. And then you layer on top of that and sprinkle on that cars and autos are becoming much more connected, they're becoming autonomous, and there's all these shared car services. I personally have taken Uber in Delhi several times. So you have all of these changes, a change in the design and the purpose of cities, changes in technology, and at the same time, there's a never going away problem of climate change, and he kind of tries to shake all that up and come up with a clear way to think about all of this. And so his book is really timely, particularly in this era of very low petroleum prices, which I think makes the continued use of automobiles and heavy use automobiles more likely, particularly internal combustion engines. So it charts a fascinating course for the future. So we're very excited to have you here. And I also want to introduce, of course, our own Ryan Kellogg, who is an expert on many things, including transportation. And I should just warn you, I've never seen Ryan in such a nice sports coat or suit before.
No, you have not.
But we're all very impressed with that and know that it is, we have you to thank for that. So it's our incredible honor to have Dr. Sumantran here, and I very much look forward to his discussion and then their conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Michael, friends at EPIC and the University of Chicago, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that I have never spoken in a more elegant classroom. It's a lovely place to be. What we thought we would do is very quickly run through a set of slides that perhaps lays out the thesis that we have in the book, and then devote a lot of the time for the discussion that Ryan and I would like to have with you. It's no surprise today. We started the research for this book about 3 years ago with my co-authors and colleagues at MIT. And we already saw something building, that the urban mobility architecture is building towards very fundamental transformation. And it's perhaps even building to a crescendo now, because you open up the newspapers and you don't have to go to industry-specific media. The general purpose media, you open it up and every day there's some news about what auto companies are doing, what mobility service providers like Uber or Lyft are doing, and indeed what cities, communities are doing in terms of how they want to transform the way the mobility architecture is structured right now. So we decided to look deeper into this. Now, if you look at the traditional auto industry strategies, they're really based on 3 pillars. They're doing a lot of work towards electrification of the automobile. They're doing a lot of work towards connecting it and creating autonomous capability. And they're doing a lot of work related to perhaps how the auto would fit in a shared economy, shared rides, shared cars, shared assets, and so on. But we found that this is still a rather limited portfolio and a limited set of building blocks for what has to be a much more dramatic transformation of the landscape. To start with, I think we live in the first urban century, or we're past the first urban century. And in the first 100 years of the last century, we went from 1 out of every 3 persons being urban to now having 1 out of practically half the population. 3 out of every 6 is urban. And the estimates are that by 2050, 4 out of every 6 will be urban. So we're increasingly becoming an urban concentrated planet. And as my friend Richard Florida would like to say, while Thomas Friedman is right, the world's become flat, it's also become spiky, because you have spikes of economic and people activity. Today, the 1% of land mass that is urban supports 55% of the population, 85% of GDP, is responsible for 78% of energy use and CO2 emissions. So we're really concentrating a lot of focus into very small pieces of land, and therefore the urban landscape, or the urban politics and the urban policies are becoming extremely important. Some of these urban spaces are going to become really gargantuan. The Jing-Jin-Ji mega city in China, the forecasts are mind-boggling. A mega super city which has greater than the population of Japan and twice the landmass of Korea, South Korea. This is going to be an economic unit as a super mega city, leading to a transformation of power. City mayors, city administrators are beginning to increasingly become activists. As Mayor Bloomberg has said, sometimes they don't want to wait for the federal government to do things. They're saying, we'll set our own agenda. And this is not true only for the US. Boris Johnson has moved London very dramatically in how he wanted to reshape the city. And Hidalgo in Paris is doing the same thing. Cities are emboldened by the fact that they are bigger sources of economic power and economic outcomes than they used to be. And as a result, they're going more vocal in how they want to transform the way they live. Sustainability initiatives, of course, well understood in our industry, but sometimes you need to put a human face to this. This little child, if she were growing up in Shanghai, Jakarta, or New Delhi, by the end of the day, through her play and school and meeting with friends, would have had the kind of particulate loading on her lungs, which is equivalent to have smoked 5 cigarettes. And this we found was an interesting graph made by Berkeley Earth. Rather than the engineering parameters of PM 2.5 concentrations in the environment, it just very simply breaks it down to particulate loading equivalent to the number of cigarettes smoked. And when you look at this is scary. And a lot of this is particulates attributable to vehicular pollution. And of course, we're seeing the climate change impact coming from CO2 concentrations. But again, if we were to translate these kinds of outcomes into economic numbers, it is estimated that the consequence of air pollution, traffic fatalities and injuries, and productivity loss in congestion adds up to somewhere between 6 and 10% of GDP. In an era when we're excited about 2 or 2.5% growth in GDP per annum, we're sacrificing 6 to 10% of GDP as economic friction coming out of the mobility architecture that we have. I think it also is related to how consumer attitudes are changing. I grew up in an era when we still were in love with cars. We had a love affair with the automobile. I'm old enough to have listened to Chuck Berry, and you're saying, driving along in your automobile with no particular place to go. You drove along in a car with no particular place to go. That's transformed to a completely different society with very different tools, very different access to communication, social window, and a social set of networks to build upon. And this love affair with cars is less true today. And in a recent survey in several academic campuses around the US, people were offered a choice of a car or a smartphone with a data plan, and 2/3 of the students chose the smartphone with a data plan. That provides more utility for their lives. And of course, this is linked to the very, very dramatic growth in the shared economy. It was interesting that both the Time magazine and The Economist over a period of 1 week, had the same kind of cover story about the shared economy. And I think for a lot of people today, the shared assets, shared services make a lot of sense. And when you consider that the average car stays idle for 96% of its time, today tools are there for us to access assets and access services and not have this kind of efficiency or lack of efficiency. So for all of this, we believe that there are a lot of fundamental changes going on. To be fair to the auto industry, they've tried their best. They have made very significant gains in things like fuel efficiency and carbon emission reduction. But sometimes even this is still not enough. Over the last 5 years, we've seen major automakers rush out not just with electric cars, but completely new brands. Mercedes says they will have a completely lineup of cars under a new brand called EQ. Volkswagen will have a new brand called ID. And so they're extremely serious about the proliferation of new electric vehicles that they will have. But I think from an engineering or from a physicist's point of view, even this is not going far enough because, a common fallacy is a zero-emission vehicle is not a zero-carbon emission vehicle. When you actually do a well-to-wheel study, somebody generates energy somewhere, and when you fuel your electric vehicle with energy, one can't be blind to the fact that there is carbon. I have no argument to the fact that electric vehicles are far more efficient than conventional vehicles. But to make the leap of faith that this is therefore a zero-emission vehicle is a fallacy. And again, the engineer in me abhors the idea that our mobility architecture involves taking a 200-pound average male or a 170-pound average female, encapsulating them in a 3,500-pound capsule, and say, this is our mobility architecture. Surely, we can do something better than this. And this is intrinsic, no matter whether you have an electric vehicle or a conventional vehicle. And of course, the space issue. The average parking spot in New York City is valued at about $500,000. Our mobility solution means that we require 107 square feet of space to transport the adult. And by the way, this is not an exceptional case. In rush hour traffic in Boston, 40% of the traffic involves single-occupant vehicles. So we are truly using up a lot of space to transport a single individual. With all this taken together, we've come up with a framework that we believe hopefully will address the kind of mobility solutions we will need in the future. For lack of better imagination, we've called it a chip mobility architecture, but that's basically related to a connected, heterogeneous, intelligent, and personalized mobility framework. And I'll just run through very quickly what I mean by this. If you look at heterogeneity, let's look at our communication interface today. We used to have the simple AT&T desk phone, which was connected by a landline, and that served as our window to connectivity. Today, look at the heterogeneity of our communications landscape. We have a huge number of devices, from Apple phones to tablets to smartphones. We have an incredible variety of apps. And we tailor this communication combination of which app and which device based on whether we're talking to family, whether we're talking to colleagues, whether we're talking to your spouse, or indeed with peers. So essentially, we mix and match this out of this heterogeneity, solutions that address each context. In a similar fashion, I think we have to re-examine mobility. Mobility thus far, in my view, has been rather unimaginatively defined. We have a bicycle, we have a car, we have a bus, we have metro trains. But I think over the next few years, we're going to see a lot of interpolation and a lot of expansion of this heterogeneity. Some of this will come from reimagining the physical asset. A bus rapid transit system, for example, is an interpolation between a bus and a metro rail. Less investment than a metro rail, more capacity than a bus. So we're going to have a lot of these Goldilocks solutions. It's an interpolation between bookends to saying we can have a little bit of this and a little bit of that in a new manifestation. And when you look at the manifestations that can be created out of a combination of physical assets and the business model, the chariot vehicle that you see here is a van-based Uber pool-like concept. It's actually funded by Ford. So here you have a dynamically routed, crowdsourced van that carries 15 people that complements transit bus service. And it's mopping up private capital. So cash-strapped municipalities and cities don't have to worry about expanding mobility solutions because they can allow the participation of a lot of this kind of private sector to come in to provide solutions. So this heterogeneity is created out of a combination of reimagining physical assets and reimagining business solutions. Similarly, if you wanted the traditional approach to getting a car, you had to lease it, or you went to Avis and you got a car for a couple of days or a week, or you had a taxi for a couple of minutes. Today, there is heterogeneity here. BMW has a plan where you subscribe to a club of BMW services, so you have a convertible for the summer and you have an SUV for the winter. People are breaking up this whole duration of association with an asset to saying, I'll give you whatever combination you want. Car to go is suitable for a couple of hours or a couple of days. So the heterogeneity is also being triggered by imagining how association of an asset is with time. And in this process, we are also blurring the divide between what is a private mode and a public mode. I think this is an important it's an important development. All over the world, people struggle with investment to fund infrastructure and city infrastructure. So as we start to blur this public-private divide, we can find a lot of intermediate solutions that are quasi-public transit, but are essentially generated or delivered using private capital. Once you have this heterogeneity of modes, you have to connect it. It can be connected by physical infrastructure. You land in Frankfurt, and you can take a long-distance train, short-range train, buses, subways, taxis. So you've got a physical location where connectivity to multi-modes is possible. You go in London, and an Oyster card can get you a whole variety of modes, including the river boat service, bicycles, and so on. The German railways, the Deutsche Bahn, have created a car hire service that operates out of railway stations. So you land at a railway station in Ulm, come outside, and there's a car waiting for you. You take it, you finish. So connectivity is becoming enabled both with physical and digital assets. We all know about the bikes that we use around the cities. Ford is looking at a bicycle you carry in the trunk of your car, which is electric, and you use this to drive 2 miles from your destination where parking is cheap, and use the last mile or the last 2 miles with a bike, which is electrically assisted. So it makes it so you're carrying your bike in a backpack effectively. And of course, we know the connectivity that comes from digital tools, and the aggressive roadmap for many, many cities or countries to blanket their entire region with a minimum of 3G and very soon 4 and 5G connectivity. Once you've connected it, I think we have the opportunity to engage intelligent systems, intelligent agents, both at the individual level and at the city level. A lot of cities around the world are making huge investments in smart city infrastructure. So you're going to have a proliferation of data with accompanying it analytics, and therefore intelligence about how the system is working and how the system around the individual is working. And these are then mapped and connected with a whole range of apps and tools that are becoming vogue in various forms. Finally, I think we live in a world that is personalized. This is the selfie generation, the me generation. I'm told 20% of Americans sport a tattoo. We're eager about self-expression. We don't want the average solution. We want to be treated uniquely and served uniquely. And mobility, too, will be demanded to be served uniquely. And here, too, we therefore have a phenomenal variety of tools. I have one app that I use in Germany and in Europe. It can synthesize an entire journey for me across multiple modes, bikes, taxis, railway tickets, and whatnot. And they're tuned to my preferences, my preference for budget, my preference for time budget that I have, my concern about the carbon footprint, and indeed, even my preference for privacy. I may want to have privacy. I may want to take my wife out to dinner in a limo, and I may have a different set of requirements for my Monday morning commute. And these can therefore be personally tailored. And therefore, this entire chip architecture is designed to be able to serve each individual uniquely based on their preferences. Auto companies are beginning to get the idea, so you get companies like Daimler and Ford and Volkswagen now start to look at a heterogeneity of solutions that they bring under one umbrella of services. If you look at the top left picture, it has the Daimler set of services. So they're really starting to move in this direction of a multimodal, connected, and a service-oriented architecture. But none of this will work, and this is the chip framework, but none of this will work without having very sound policies that govern regulations, use of land, financial tariffs, incentives, and so on. And so we see that this chip framework will depend upon mature governance. Until last week, we believed that these rules and regulations would actually motivate users to switch from one mode or to another, preferably a more socially acceptable mode. But over the last week, we've changed our vocabulary. So now we say these are nudge. Didn't flow quite as smoothly as I wanted, but yes. So these policies, regulations, and combination of incentives and disincentives are really intended to nudge how people will use mobility. So if I were to go back, so today you find cities improving their focus on pedestrian access. This used to be a disused railway line in Seoul. Today it's a beautiful, across the city, pedestrian zone. Bikes are sprouting in all cities. We have bus rapid transit systems and interesting new mobility solutions occurring in many of the, particularly the emerging market economies. Transport for London has done a lot in terms of integrating the entire concept, bringing a multitude of services under one umbrella. And importantly, I think I was talking to a startup innovator here. This chip architecture has to be open. It has to be an open architecture because we're going to see a lot more innovation in modes and solutions. And so we have to have an architecture where all kinds of things, whether it's a mapping activity, the mobile ticketing activity, an on-demand mobility solution, can all come in, and not all of them will be successful, but we have to have a framework that these can plug in to work. So I think there is a role for policy to nudge how people are going to be served and how people are going to want to change their mobility habits. And we see a lot of this now. In Tallinn, in Estonia, public transit is free. In Centennial in Colorado, the last mile connectivity to your rail, the light rail system, is subsidized through use of Lyft. In the Canary Wharf financial district in London, they've limited the number of parking spaces so that people would use the Docklands light rail, essentially shifting people from personal to public modes. I think this is the opposite example of what Richard Thaler tried to do in Chicago. I think the example I saw for his nudge was to actually build a parking lot so that faculty would attend meetings on time. So I suppose that's why the good Lord gave us two elbows. You can nudge to the left or nudge to the right. Singapore has pricing. Paris bans cars. So there are a multitude of ways in which we can actually nudge people to different behaviors. In summary, for us, the chip architecture will accelerate the shift to thinking about mobility as a service. We believe it is adaptable. It is as relevant to a Detroit as it is to a Hong Kong. It is democratic and equitable because we believe that the idea of a user pays philosophy will make sure that you allow people choice, but when they use the choice or exercise the choice, they pay a full and fair price for the choice that they make. And because it is a use-as-needed mobility, it is green and sustainable. We believe that hopefully, if societies were able to get onto this kind of an architecture, it will hopefully lead to mobility that is faster, smarter, and greener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I believe you're supposed to be on
okay.
the right. And, so thank you for that enlightening presentation and description of your framework and your book. Where I thought I'd start the conversation, seeing as we're sitting here at a Energy Policy Institute event, would be to sort of turn towards the energy relevant aspects of the chip architecture, and then perhaps broaden from there, or broaden as we go. And one of the things I thought it would be kind of fun to touch on, especially as an economist and particularly as an environmental economist, one of the things we like to advocate quite often are policies that involve things like user fees and fees that appropriately account for the full social costs of travel. And you indeed touched on many of those aspects at the end of your talk. One of the things I'm curious to hear your take on is some of the difficulties in achieving political support and political consensus for those sort of very important, sort of whether it's a fee or whether it's a nudge. We know that cities such as London have been able to make great progress in those fronts. Here in the US, less so. New York tried to implement a congestion charge. It didn't work. Washington State tried to implement a carbon tax, weren't able to garner support. And there are lots of reasons you hear for why this is difficult in the US, from red team, blue team divide, concerns about equity, concerns about what government does with the money. What are your thoughts about sort of building consensus around these types of important policies that sort of lead us to sort of equilibrium solutions that generate large benefits?
No, there is no doubt, when we talk about the adaptability of a framework like this, we have to keep in mind an environment like Singapore, an environment like London, an environment like New York. And if you thought you had difficulty in taking the public along or taking policy along a city like New Delhi in India, we have our fair share of intransigent politics and very hard to work convergence. But nevertheless, I think if you look at the success stories, first of all, there is no doubt the operating governance model has a large effect. Singapore can very quickly make a decision and say, this is what we want to implement, and they can do it. In many cities, including in the US, in India, in Europe, you need to really marshal support. You need to make sure that the public is with you in terms of what you want to do. This therefore leads to the second element, which is how well we are able to articulate what we want to do and how we're able to educate people as to why it is being done. In Boston right now, the city has a plan called Go Boston 2030. They're looking at remapping the entire mobility landscape of Boston. And for 6 months, the city actually sent out teams in what looked like colorfully painted food delivery vans. And there were kiosks all over the city. And they were taking in community inputs. Pain points today, what they would like to see, how they figured they would want to be mobile in the future. So this was an effort to both communicate what they wanted to do and at the same time get inputs as to how they would configure the system. The third is technology. I mean, today we have a lot more tools than we had before. The entire London congestion fees operated with electronic cameras, digital cameras, license plates that are scanned, and you're able to identify who you're going to levy a fee on. As cities start to become smarter and they look at the smart city infrastructure, I think we're going to embed a lot of tools which is going to make a lot of this less difficult. The whole idea of economics is to come down to a smaller unit of space and time. Today we can do that. We don't have to use the axe. We can use a scalpel to define how we're going to levy fees. And the last is, as London has done, they've done a very credible job of integrating the operating of these entities. So whether it is road maintenance, traffic lights, the bus service, the tube, the operating environment is under one umbrella. So they're able to coordinate. I think in a lot of countries, including the US and certainly in India, the people who manage the roads have nothing to do with the people who operate the buses, and they have nothing to do with the people who manage traffic. So bringing coordination across this is more difficult. London has proven that as you start to bring this coordination, a lot of things are enabled.
And running with the London example, sort of the integration of the data and the coordination, is that done separately? Is that done centrally within the city government, or is that a service that's farmed out to a private entity or something in between?
I think London's done a very interesting, they've taken a very interesting road. In an era when we're talking about open data, they've actually made the TfL data to be open data. So they have essentially said, we can't manage all the apps, we can't manage all the kinds of functionality we would want out of this data. They've truly believed that more can be done out of this than they could manage. So they've essentially thrown open the data, and so you have an app like City Mapper. It's a startup, they come in and they take the hooks, they take the data, and City Mapper therefore can synthesize a journey for you from your home across multiple modes because they're able to access and use the data that these systems have. So London's taken a very profound step by saying our database should be open. Now, if London's operator was an Uber, it's going to be more difficult to get a private operator to pry open their data. But this is a dialogue that a lot of the cities around the world are already having now. This boundary between what ought to be data for public good that is anonymized and is protected against loss of privacy versus data that is truly private for competitive advantage.
Interesting. So, yeah, and how do you sort of see that playing out? And I have in my mind the US example where if I think where do a lot of our current mobility data sit? It's in part with companies like Uber, in large part companies like Google, who, I turn on my phone, I have an Android, Google knows where I am, where I've been recently. They probably have a pretty good guess of where I'm going sometime soon and maybe where I'm going tomorrow. It's actually quite remarkable, and those data are immensely valuable. How should city governments interact with a company like Google that retains ownership and is presumably loath to let it go?
I have no answer because the problem is open and it is still evolving. All I can say is we will continue to see a lot of evolution of this because data is dynamic. With the sensors that are getting added, the Internet of Things means that each of us are going to be associated with 7 to 9 devices that's broadcasting data all the time. So there is going to be a huge amount of data that's out there, and I think we have to understand what data has to be private, what has to be anonymized, and what should be public. And even in the domain of public, it is a loose boundary between what is data that should be shared for common good and what is data that is legitimately private for competitive advantage. I think this will evolve, but this last week, the CEO of Uber has rushed to London because basically London said, okay, you're getting out of here. And unless you change the way you behave, we're going to throw you out of London. So now all of a sudden, I think this will happen, and they will be forced to open up some of their data. I think in a democracy, we can assume that there will be consideration for what is data that truly has to be private for competitive advantage. But it's going to be a moving boundary. I think certain cities will push harder, certain cities may take a looser definition. But I see us moving definitely towards that equilibrium.
And I guess sort of thinking further about sort of the private versus public boundary, we've just been talking about data, but of course there's the infrastructure itself, including sort of physical infrastructure. If we think about subways, which have traditionally at least been public, but now we see, you mentioned bus rapid transit, and my understanding there is that there's a mix depending which city you're in, whether that's publicly provided, which I believe is, say, the Seattle model, as opposed to something in Curitiba, which I had the pleasure of visiting recently, and I understand was one of the very first systems, and that's a private-public partnership, all the way to things like Chariot that you mentioned, which is entirely private. So what do you see as sort of the drivers of private versus public mix and some of the trade-offs in these different sorts of infrastructure, given the substantial infrastructure investment that really needs to be made in order to actually realize the vision?
I think this is a very important issue, and if you take a lot of the emerging economies around the world, frankly, the problems we are creating right now is a result of public capital being inadequate to stay ahead of development. So if you take a city like New Delhi, we are evolving sprawl as we speak, even though every theorist will tell you it's absolutely the wrong thing to have. We are essentially evolving towards a Los Angeles, which is going to be a disaster for the economics of our mobility. And the simple reason is the public funding is not able to keep pace with the speed of development. Now, if we are capital constrained on something like this, clearly we've got to find an intelligent way of mopping private capital as long as it serves societal goals. If Delhi could restrict itself to a more compact perimeter, and if transport services could be enabled by not everybody going out and buying their car or their motorcycle, you would find an ability to balance how the city spreads and making sure that within the contained area there is dense mobility. We never had things like Chariot before. Chariot is an outcome of an ability to crowdsource data and pick up fares along the way by dynamically routing a van. We didn't have tools and technologies before. But the advantage of a Chariot van over Uber taxi is the Chariot van transports 15 people at a time. So with that footprint, you're actually putting in 15 people as opposed to an Uber taxi carrying one fare or maybe two. So I think we have to be able to bring in private capital. Of course, it leads to a lot of issues. For instance, in the example we showed here about Centennial in Colorado, if a Lyft taxi is being subsidized to bring somebody from the last mile to the railhead to feed the light rail service, you get into this issue of how much of the profit of the private enterprise should the public really pay for? These are going to be people like you are better placed to answer that question, but it's a front line we will face. It's a front line we will confront, and I think it's going to evolve over how. But at the end of the day, the guiding beacon to me would be a demonstration of what is for common good. If we can constantly tune systems, we will never get it right first time. It's like software. It's going to be tuned, it's going to be adapted, it's going to have version 2.1 and 2.2. But as long as there is visibility that it's being steered towards common good, I think we'll have a better chance of explaining why it's rational.
Right. And I like sort of what you just said at the end about sort of flexibility and being ready for changes. I mean, if we think about people just sitting 10 years ago making mobility investments for today, so things that would have been proposed, anything that would have been durable potentially could have been very misplaced had it been sort of permanent. So particularly things, for example, this is why I worry about things like light rail relative to bus rapid transit, which is more flexible. So what are ways in which we could guide, whether it's sort of a private firm investing in mobility, or sort of speaking to mayors about public investment, sort of ways in which we can steer investments towards flexibility as opposed to, say, whatever the flavor is this year?
I think there is, again, a role for education. I think for a book like what we've got out, we created deliberately flexible framework. I'd be the first to admit that it needs a lot more props to support it, and certainly economic arguments and economic analysis of how various mechanisms would work. But collectively, this framework and the economic support structures and the dynamics of that would need to be carried forward to a number of cities that are growing right now. We've identified among three outcomes from the book, advocacy and education as two important elements of the book. We believe it's important to take this advocacy to cities who are really now embarking on huge investments, particularly when they're making investments in smart city infrastructure. Is there a way that we can actually get them to think about the full picture properly? And the second, of course, is education. I think we have to educate consumers, we have to educate the policy makers need a lot of education all over the world, and I think there's a big role to be filled there.
Yeah, there's a large building across the Midway called the Harris School that I work at, which hopefully can play a role in that education with regards to public policy.
We'd love to do that.
I can't help but make the plug. So when it comes to these sorts of changes and this flexibility, if I'm sitting, say, at Ford or General Motors, and I see your presentation and I read your book, in some sense, so one potential read of that would be, I'm terrified and I'm afraid of the future, because it almost seems like what's being called for is a dramatically reduced role for traditional automotive transport. So what are ways that we can think about enrolling the traditional automotive industry in this vision of the future, so that rather than providing roadblocks and obstacles through policy influence or whatever, that we can have traditional automakers, and I don't mean to pick on Ford and GM, but sort of the broad industry, to be partners and supportive in a more flexible way of moving ourselves around.
No, we just come fresh out of launching the book in Detroit on Wednesday. There is no doubt a very significant component of fear and being terrified. They are terrified about what will we do in this environment, because it's not playing to the strengths of their game plan and not the strengths of, or leveraging the assets that they have invested in already. The more profound ones are already beginning to say, listen, we've got to change because we're going to get left behind. And there are enough examples of, Apple's migration from being a computer company to what they are today, or Amazon's transformation from being a bookseller to what they are today. I think there are examples of how one would have to, break boundaries and say we're playing in a new field and we have a completely new business or an opportunity landscape. Having said that, I think I've been in the auto industry for 30 years to know that they have some legitimate roadblocks or obstacles. A principal one of them being, I think, the way they access capital. Again, I'm not an economist, but my view is I have a sense that there are three kinds of capital at play in the world today. There's the kind of capital that you often see in China, huge, generous, funded by provinces and the state, very low cost of money, and willing to invest rather liberally in strategic ventures. Then you have a second kind of capital, and maybe sovereign funds fall somewhere in there. The second kind of capital is private equity or wealthy, Silicon Valley investors who sit at the table and say, I'm going to place 10 bets. I know no more than 2 of them will pay off, but I'm willing to place my bets. And out of that could come an Uber or a Lyft or a Tesla, and out of something else could be 8 of the 10 could be failures. And it's a speculative capital deployment. And then you have the traditional sources of capital that the GMs and the Fords have to go to. And these kinds of capital are very, very discriminating, and they scrutinize where and how money is going to be used. I mean, look at Mark Fields. He just turned in the best year ever at Ford with $9 billion, and the next week he's out of a job. And it is a very tricky business of keeping investors sufficiently confident that you're investing for the future and sufficiently reassured that you're not wasting your money. So it's a very difficult line to walk.
Yeah, I mean, does that almost suggest that there's a disconnect in the investing community that the investors want Ford and companies like Ford to be looking towards the future, and by future I mean long-run future, not next year's results. But at the same time, they almost make it difficult to raise money for more speculative ventures. And
exactly. I think it's a challenge that the auto industries face. We've spent a lot of time with Bill Ford and his think tank, with leadership at GM. I think they do genuinely face a challenge of how they're going to take this message across. And maybe they may have to do something like what BMW has done. They've carved out a separate iVentures entity, and they're letting some of this investment happen out of that entity. But this is still landscape that's evolving.
I see. And sort of speaking of sort of the auto manufacturers, wanted to ask you a little bit more about electrification, which you touched on early in the talk. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you see sort of electrification of the vehicle fleet interacting with the chip architecture. Does chip help enable electrification? Does electrification help enable chip?
I think the chip architecture, relying as it does on policies and regulations. I know for a long time the US was unable to carry forward the idea of a gas tax. I think if I remember right, in 1950, the percentage of tax in the price of fuel in Germany was about the same as the percentage of tax on the price of fuel in the US. Today in Germany, the percentage of tax is 8 times the percentage of tax on fuel in the US. Maybe chip architecture in a redefinition of what is carbon and what is the carbon footprint of a journey. And maybe, and this is where again, we think these kinds of frameworks need a lot of support from people like you and EPIC and University of Chicago, economists who will actually make visible what is the true and fair cost of a journey. As we showed in the slide, if we're losing 6 to 10% of our GDP because of inefficiencies in our mobility architecture, at some stage, one is going to say, nudging movement into a direction that is going to remove that 6 to 10% of loss is worth a lot of investment and worth a lot of subsidy. So I think this business of making visible why there are going to be interventions, and again, making sure that that intervention is resulting in a better solution overall, and it's oriented to common good.
I see. And sort of, in terms of sort of getting to this vision and sort of this very positive vision of the future of mobility that you lay out, I'm wondering what you see as what are potentially the biggest potential stumbling blocks we might face, and sort of what are sort of, if you were, say, giving advice to a policymaker, how do we avoid going down roads where sort of new technologies, whether it be automation or electrification, potentially lead us in the absence of policies such as adequate pricing, lead us to places where we're not really solving the problems of congestion or the environment?
I think these are going to me, these are going to be the kinds of issues that sit at the interface of technology and policy. We still are struggling with how will we deal with big data. We know what we can do with big data, but how does it sit with the right kinds of use of big data and the protection of individuals, protection of private data, protection of consumers, that kind of an issue. We also have to look at, we talk about autonomy. There are a lot of issues that sit at the interface of autonomy and policy. One is safety. To many people, the simpler explanation of autonomy is that it eliminates all the cases of accidents caused by human error. But we have not fully explored the space of accidents caused by machine malfunction. I don't want to be alarmist, but that is an issue that has to be solved. There is the whole issue of ethics in the decision making in an algorithm. I have to program a car at some stage to say, if I have two options, take option B, and there might be an ethical implication on that.
Oh.
So there are those kinds of issues that also have to be tackled. So I think this is going to be, it's a little bit like what we talked about cities. Development is running faster than infrastructure can catch up. I think technology and innovation is running faster than policy can catch up. And somehow we need to make sure that they don't get too out of kilter, because the last thing we want is either of AI or big data to come and hurt society. And today they can.
And especially as I think about, say, a transitional period, especially with regard to automation, I mean, is there a stumbling block in sort of person A driving a fully automated car, not at the wheel, trying to sense everything around it and potentially interact with other vehicles, and I'm driving in my dumb car that I drive right now and driving in my own dumb way? Presumably that must create special problems which make the transition challenging.
It's for that reason that the MIT startup Nutonomy, they chose to prototype their autonomous cars in an industrial park in Singapore. And the reason is you've lowered variability of a lot of constraints and a lot of unplanned or uncontrolled variables. You've limited the role of uncontrolled variables. The streets are well defined, the sidewalks are well defined, there are proper cross zones, people are instructed, people don't step off curbs. So once you have lowered variability, then you are giving a better chance for machine systems to work. Over time, I'm sure they'll get better. I have no doubt that we've seen the advances with machine learning and automation and robotics. They can deliver a lot of value. But in this transition, we have to make sure that we gradually get to the state of improved capability. Rushing too far ahead, for example, I think Tesla was caught running a little further ahead than their systems were capable. They've had a backlash from consumers. They've had a backlash from their suppliers. Many of their suppliers have walked away saying, we don't want to be involved with this anymore because you guys are running way too risky on this.
In particular with regard to the accident that they had
Exactly.
a year or two ago?
Yeah.
Let's see. So before I open it up to sort of audience questions, let me ask one more, which is coming from the perspective of a research institution. What would you say are the top 2 or 3 sort of research activities we should be really thinking about here at Chicago to shape the future, whether it's something on the science and engineering front or something more on the policy or economic or behavioral science front?
I think there is the mechanics of assembling a chip architecture are reasonably well understood, and because it's a system that plays with, we can plug in a Tesla very easily into this model. We can plug in an Uber into this model. We can plug in a public transit authority into this model. The physical plugging in is actually not so bad. We can have technologies to interconnect them. That's easy. I believe that to take this forward to acceptance by cities and societies, it's easy to say, as long as every user pays a full and fair share of the price. Now, what is that full and fair share of the price of travel? I think that is a very big hole. And again, speaking in this institution, I think there's a tremendous amount of value you can add to, because it's not just our framework. We've been speaking about this all over the country and all over the world. We see a surfeit of people willing to talk about technologies, connectivity, 5G connections, and autonomy. We see a lot of capability there. We don't see enough to actually support such a framework with the basis of economics and pricing.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.